Hello, I'm Jeremiah Gibson. I'm the president of the New England Association for Family and Systemic Therapy, or NEAFAST, and I'm so happy to be joined this afternoon by Steve Gaddis. Steve is the director of the Narrative Therapy Initiative in Salem, and we wanted to take a few minutes today to talk about some upcoming trainings that are going on in the NTI and to talk a little bit more about narrative therapy. So, Steve, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Jeremiah. Thank you for making this happen and keeping the family therapy world active and alive in Massachusetts.
Thanks.
Family therapy was my first home professionally.
Yeah, definitely mine too. And I'm curious, as family therapy was your first professional home, how did you kind of meander from family therapy specifically into narrative therapy?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Well, there's so many places to start and so many stories to tell that it's hard to select what to begin with. But I guess I would say that I met it in 1993. I think I met narrative therapy in my master's in marriage and family therapy at Colorado State University. When I was a graduate student there, and this woman, Toni Zimmerman, was the director at the time, and Toni was way ahead of her time in terms of infusing the program with social construction.
Toni is still ahead of her time.
Yes, she is. I mean, I have not been in touch with Toni for so long. So you know Toni?
I do, yeah. She did training for me when I did the AAMFT supervision.
Oh, fantastic. She's an amazing, energetic, intelligent person who I really feel grateful to have been, at the head of the program at the time. And so she had brought a lot of feminist, multiculturalism ideas, social constructionist ideas into the program. And I was learning a lot. I had started in psychology and was pretty unexcited by most of the ideas and ways of thinking about how to help that I was learning in psychology and even in family therapy. The survey courses I had, I wasn't feeling particularly excited by much of what I was learning through the course of the theories course for the year. I had decided to become a therapist later in my early 30s. I had really kind of experiences throughout my adolescence in therapy because I've been subject to abuse and violence as a boy and was experiencing the effects of that, and people who were trying to help me, my mom, therapists, all well-intended, caring, good people, but the therapy itself was not helpful for me. And upon reflection, I think it wasn't just neutral, it had harmful effects. So when I decided to become therapist, it was after I'd had some really nice experiences with a therapist in San Francisco when I was about 30. And so I had these kind of juxtaposed experiences in therapy that kind of inspired me to think about exploring the idea of becoming a therapist myself and seeing if I could be helpful, and sort of exploring what did it mean to be helpful? What did it mean to kind of think about problems, how to be with people? So when I went into graduate school, I was looking for something that could help me answer those questions in a way that felt good to me. So I wasn't finding anything I was finding particularly helping me answer those questions until there was like a 3-hour class that I think only half of it was dedicated to narrative therapy. Michael White and David Epstein's book, Narrative Means to Therapeutic Ends, had just come out.
Right.
And Toni said, her kind of thing at the end of every class was, if you were going to read one thing in this particular approach, here's what I would suggest. So she had suggested that book. That was, I think, the first book I decided to actually read. And the first chapter of that book is about power and knowledge and story. And that just hooked me. I became really excited and interested in what that was and immersed myself fully in it. And it's been a love affair ever since. It's, taken me around the world. It's gotten me to write.
Yeah.
I'm just really, after my wife and kids, it's my most precious relationship.
Yeah. When you studied narrative therapy, who and what were some of the profound experiences that you had in your training of narrative therapy?
Well, I had to kind of train myself because there wasn't much available to me except through what I was reading. And, I started reading everything I could that Michael White had written, and, just found that to be really helpful in getting me to think about how to try things in my practice and just kind of learn through trial and error and making mistakes and reflecting. And I quickly became known as the narrative guy because nobody kind of around me knew much about narrative. And
Right.
it was kind of painful at times because it was sort of, I was kind of characterized pejoratively as too narrative. And I felt like that was a misunderstanding of what I experience as the sophistication and the rigor and the breadth of the assumptions and ideas that are the foundation of the narrative worldview.
Right.
And so the first formal training I had, Michael came to Albuquerque in, I think, 1996.
Mm-hmm.
And did what became a kind of a famous workshop there, where a lot of it, there were probably about 150 of us there.
Yeah.
And one thing, I ended up going on to get a doctorate at Syracuse, and one of my professors there was Ken Hardy, which many people will know. And Ken really was an amazing teacher for me. One of the things that I came to care a lot about through Ken's teaching was congruence, just people striving to live the ideas they say they stand for. And one of the things about Michael that I just really experienced was that sense of congruence, that he was really embodying a lot of the values, the ethics, the practices that, he was also teaching and kind of benefiting from in terms of people being interested in and stuff.
Right.
So that was very heartening. And kind of the first, formal training I had, which, whet my appetite for more.
Yeah. Well, narrative therapy isn't just applied Foucault. Narrative therapy is an embodiment of some of the values and some of the principles of Foucault, some of the post-structuralists, and some of the folks who evaluated that. And I'm curious, which of those values came the most natural for you, were the most exciting for you as you began to practice narrative therapy?
Oh, that's a great question, Jeremiah. I think, like most people, I was introduced to power at a young age. And so I have a pretty strong sense of forms of power that had to do with domination and kind of physical strength and intimidation and kind of the ability to influence through kind of repression and holding people back, through physical threats or violence or whatever. But I think I also had knowledge about power in the form of meaning making, and but I didn't have a language for it. I didn't have kind of a way of making sense out of it in other than a felt experience. And so when I was introduced to narrative and Michael's kind of introduction to Foucault, my introduction to Foucault through Michael, and the idea that power operates in this kind of normative judgment and discourse and meaning making, that just got exciting because it helped me have a way of understanding ways of being influenced and constrained or even constituted, that I felt like made it possible for me to experience something different in relation to the problems in my own life. So, one of the things that was immediately exciting to me is that I felt like as I was engaging with narrative ideas and practices and ethics,
Yeah.
I was feeling some help myself
Sure.
for my own struggles in my life. So I thought that might be a legitimate criteria to think about possibly bringing these things to other people and see if they
Yeah.
found them helpful. But I would say even more specifically, the kind of notions of accountability
Hmm.
was one, like, that kind of practice of accountability in relationships and being curious about the real effects, however unintended they might be in a relationship. Um, the sense of who's at the center of the meaning making at any time, understanding, um, those kinds of things, and particularly what I would come to know, at Michael would describe as the decentered and influential position that the narrative therapist takes up in their conversations, so that we're bringing skills to be helpful, but the people we're talking with are at the center of the meaning making and leading the conversation.
Yeah. The thing that I love about our field is that so many of the different models that we have don't just transform us as therapists, they transform us as people. And in a bit, we'll talk about some of the year-long training modules that you guys have. But I'm curious, what are some values that you hope that participants of these programs also get to embody, get to experience as they go through these two programs?
Yeah, again, I appreciate the question. I think, just to back up a second with something you said, I think one of the things that's something very important for me to hold up is this idea that narrative therapy is more a way of being in a worldview than a technique or a kind of a strategy or something like that, where it's not something that I just do when I'm with clients and then I don't do in the rest of my life. It informs all domains of my life,
Mm-hmm.
my relationship with Ashley, as a dad, as a teacher, hopefully it's shaping how I'm approaching this conversation with you.
Yeah.
So for me, I have a hard time now separating in kind of rigid ways conversations that are different in what gets called therapy, or what gets called training, or what gets called life. And
Sure.
so when I hope to embody these in the trainings that we do, and the teachers that are part of NTI know do as well. And our hope is that we help people know about what's possible through the narrative worldview and practice,
Yeah.
primarily through experiential learning, through kind of exploring how these ideas make it possible for them to develop richer stories about what they care about, what they stand for, their hopes and dreams, and through that, and then also whatever problems they may be experiencing in their life, and how it helps change relationships with those problems. And in that process, we think that people will get the best knowledge about whether this is a way of working that they like or they don't like, or and so we really emphasize the experiential quite significantly. So it's a very, the personal, professional, and political really kind of are part of the experience.
Yeah. What are some other aspects of the narrative worldview that, as a teacher, you get excited to witness in your students and with your clients as you teach and as you practice narrative therapy?
Well, the most exciting thing for me is when I witness people experiencing themselves as the knowers of their own lives and relationships. When I witness them, um, experiencing an ability to have the final say for themselves about what things mean and how to understand things. So we just recently had a end of year ceremony for our certificate program, and the structure of that is the students present what had been most meaningful to them
Yeah.
in the course. And these are some of the most moving days of my life. Like, I get to witness not them sort of explaining what narrative therapy is, or, sort of teaching narrative therapy or anything like that, but showing how their ability to know what's precious to them, to have it be unique and specific to them,
Yeah.
is presented and honored and witnessed and celebrated.
Yeah.
And so the thing that I love most is just helping each person experience a kind of dignity that I think is at the center of the ethics and values in the narrative worldview.
That's great. I'm wondering if I can ask a couple questions also about the programming for 2019-2020. You
Sure.
alluded to the narrative certificate program, and
Yeah.
then there's another program that you guys are offering too, which is called, remind me,
It's the apprenticeship program.
the apprenticeship program.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could take a few minutes to describe both of those, the certificate program and the apprenticeship program.
Yeah, I'd love to. These are emerging programs. We're a small nonprofit organization that started 10 years ago, and we've just been slowly growing, trying to do it at a sustainable rate and without any outside funding. Everything is tuition funded at this point, but we've tried to develop training opportunities where people can fit in at whatever level they're at and whatever interest level they have. So right now we offer a 1-day kind of introduction to the worldview called What is Narrative Therapy? And we offer that a couple times a year as a way for people to get a taste of this without too much of a commitment. And then we have a 2-day narrative therapy in practice, which then if people want to follow up the 1 day, that's a way they can learn more about some of the practices that have been developed within this worldview, externalizing, deconstructing, reauthoring are the names of some of those practices. And then if they still find themselves interested, then we have these 2 10-month-long programs. And the primary difference between the two is just the level of commitment. So the apprenticeship program is a peer facilitated consultation, exploration of the narrative worldview that meets once a month on a Friday for the whole day. And myself or another NTI faculty are there to help facilitate that. It's highly experiential, lots of practices of just kind of being introduced some ideas and then putting them into practice and trying them out, and that kind of thing. The certificate program is more rigorous. It involves some readings, some writings, some practice intensives. So we meet a few times a year for 2-day practice intensives where we dive into different practices quite deeply. There's a weekly online small group meeting that happens on Tuesday nights, so people can stay connected to the learning and their concerns. There's multiple faculty that teach in this course who students just adore. So and so those are the primary differences between the two that I can think of.
How might someone interested in learning more about narrative therapy be able to make an informed choice as to whether or not the apprenticeship program fits them better than the certificate program, or vice versa?
Yeah, well, the easiest way is just to contact me, and I'm happy to have a conversation with anybody about that. But I think you can read some about it on the website. The differences. We're developing an application kind of process so that people can discern whether it's a good fit for them.
Yeah.
Those are some thoughts. Yeah.
Okay. And the website, remind me again, is www.
Yeah, narrativetherapyinitiative.org.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah.
What prerequisites, if any, are there to
Oh.
joining one of these two programs?
Yeah, for the 2-year-long courses, I think it's important that people have some exposure to the worldview and some of the practices. So at a minimum, I would say at least the 1 day kind of narrative, what is narrative therapy, and the 2 days narrative therapy in practice, or a course in graduate school that they might have had in narrative therapy, or some or the equivalent somewhere, having done some narrative training somewhere. But it doesn't have to be very extensive, just not completely brand new to the worldview.
Gotcha. You mentioned in the narrative therapy certificate program that there is a project that students do, a way of incorporating the narrative worldview and narrative principles into a particular lens or a particular kind of pocket of practice. I'm curious to learn more about how that works and what's an idea or two that you've seen students do that have been really valuable.
Well, yeah, no, that's a good question. I think, the goal of all narrative therapy is what's called rich story development.
Mm-hmm.
So that, if we think about people living their lives through stories, then and internalizing narratives that are often kind of, supported by culturally dominant discourses of gender, race, class, whatever, then they've often internalized stories as truths that are not fitting best with what's important to them, and yet have a lot of power. So part of the certificate program project is for students to experience personally what it means to have their own stories about what they care about much more thickly developed and described as a result of participating in the course.
Yeah.
So the projects are just them sort of sharing with us a rich account of something that they hold precious. And so that can be, it's very unique to each student. And one of the practices in narrative therapy is what's called outsider witnessing. So when these presentations are made, we follow them up with responses about how we were moved by them and where it took us and what we care about and acknowledgement of that. So so it's very moving, and you asked me to remember the specifics of a couple, and that's going to be difficult for me to do. Let me think.
That part up too.
Yeah, but it's a great question, and one example of a presentation that comes to mind was, so these happen over 2 days, a Friday and Saturday.
Okay.
And through the course, one of the women in the course was in her small group interviewed about what was meaningful to her, what's precious to her. And she talked about how she experienced problems, and the metaphor, the image she used was a fog that would creep over and kind of, have its effects on her life and try to convince her that there was something wrong with her, and so on and so forth. Something I think many of us can relate to, how problems try to influence our lives.
Sure.
So I live pretty near the ocean, and she decided for her presentation, she was going to take us all for a walk to the beach. And in the walk to the beach, she was sharing with us what the significance of this event was, the significance to her of taking us to the beach and reclaiming her life from the fog that kind of had too many negative effects on her life, and talked about how, I forget exactly the words that she used, which would be precious to remember, but something in general about the importance of it being okay to not be perfect and not have to kind of succumb to the perfectionist discourse, and then sort of link that to how that had her thinking about who and how she wanted to be as a therapist in her work, particularly around chronic illness, which is an area that she both has a lot of knowledge of personally and wants to do work in professionally.
Sure.
So, just, and then so 10 or 12 of those in 2 days. They're 30-minute presentations, and they're just stunningly moving. Um,
Right.
you know.
I imagine it's really cool as a director to also be not just in the experience of, not just in the position of director, but also in the learner.
Yeah, I mean, that's another principle in the narrative worldview that I adore, is that, these are two-way relationships. They're not one-way relationships. And,
Right.
um, you know, um, so yes, I am certainly benefiting immensely, both from the learning and the ways it keeps me hopeful and heartened about the possibilities that this tradition of thinking can
Mhm.
make. And so, one of the hopes I had for the narrative therapy initiative is to be a vehicle to kind of help grow and authenticate and legitimize these very, you know, non-traditional ideas about how to be thinking about help, how to think about people, how to think about problems.
Yeah.
And so as more and more people come through and become part of our community and then go out and kind of grow these things, it's just incredibly satisfying and
Yeah.
invigorating. And,
Right.
we have just an amazing community of people that I come to really think about as family as much as anything else. Yeah.
Absolutely. What are some ways that you've observed students take the narrative worldview and apply it effectively and in meaningful ways in the ways that they practice therapy, be that with individuals, couples, or families?
Yeah, it's not easy because so many of them go into contexts where, there's not immediate support or appreciation for these ways of working and being. And, it really takes a lot of perseverance and in some ways some subversiveness at times to kind
Sure.
of, change culture or open up possibilities for something new. But I've seen everything from just like these heroic micro influences to students kind of bringing me in as a consultant to their agency and train entire staffs to so one of the recent graduates is bringing ideas about how to have conversations around racial identity from a narrative perspective into a school context where it
Wow.
works. So, just lots of different, and that's kind of what I hope to create next is um, a program that follows the certificate program that I've called the diploma program, but we haven't really got it up and going yet. But that will be where people who really have a good grasp of this narrative worldview, which the certificate program I think gives you a really solid foundation,
Yeah.
can then kind of take on a topic or a subject that they're passionate about and develop either a workshop or a paper or both. And my hope is in 2020 to like have some kind of event where the alumni of these programs do presentations for the larger community about how they've taken these ideas into their work.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. We look forward to hearing more about that event and
Maybe we can partner on that together.
learning how we can partner together in doing that. So, one last question. This is a question that I ask everyone in video interviews and in the blog interviews is, what feedback would you give to therapists who are new to the field
Mm.
to help them maintain a sense of perseverance?
Oh, lovely question. I get very concerned about how completing graduate school can introduce new practitioners to this idea that they should now understand themselves as fully equipped and prepared to know what to do.
Right.
And that, somehow they should adopt this identity as expert and professional and knower.
Yeah.
And I think that can really be very oppressive and
Sure.
harmful and support burnout.
Yeah.
Um, and so what I would say I think is most important is um, to find your own relationship to ways of thinking about how to help and ways to think about problems, and see if you can't find a community to become a part of. And if you need to, even though we don't make much money, try to find some way to get support for your ongoing skill development, your ongoing
Right.
confidence, and feeling like you have a story about knowing what you want to do and how you want to be. And I think, um, you know, graduate school and agencies often aren't able to provide that for you.
Right.
So, yeah, I'm interested in what you think just about those ideas initially. I might have some more, but I'd be curious about
Yeah.
what you think about those, Jeremiah.
Well, I'm really drawn to this idea of not knowing. Knowing has been a really important part of my story and a lot of the construction of my identity.
Mm-hmm.
As someone who grew up in gifted and talented programs in school,
Mm,
as a man, as a white presenting person, as a Christian, as someone who grew up in a Christian context.
mm,
So I think that a lot of the work that I've done with some narrative worldview practice is becoming okay with the process of not knowing
mm-hmm,
and experiencing kindness to myself,
mm,
um, being gentle with myself when things don't come out the way that I want, or if I ask a question that doesn't make sense, being compassionate towards myself and practicing that and giving myself the permission to not know, which is really an equalizing principle from a relationship standpoint. That allows me to join with my clients, with my partner, with my friends on an equal playing field.
yeah, that's lovely. I think one of the most important practices in the narrative worldview is curiosity, right? And so, I think for me, rather than not knowing, I prefer to think about curiosity.
Hmm.
And
How would you
uh,
distinguish the difference between the two?
well, I don't think it's true that we don't know things,
Hmm.
and I think it's whether or not we're centering them or not.
True.
So if we're curious, we can be centering the knowing of another person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, and also I think we are learning things that we know about how we practice. Like, what are the skills that we're bringing? Why are we asking this question and not this question? There's knowing in that. So I don't want that to be disqualified or marginalized. But I really appreciate what you're saying about the idea that not knowing what's meaningful to another person, not knowing what stories are influencing their lives, and I do think, like you, I had a relationship with knowing as kind of what was the measure of a successful person.
Right.
And so, it is always uncomfortable for me to take up this curious practice, but
Sure.
it's an ethic that I am committed to.
Yeah.
I see it as an act of love. I see it as an act of respect. And I don't know what more people want than to be met with that kind of interest in their lives and their thinking and their hopes. And, if we're providing that, that to me is such an honor. And so I guess back to what you were saying about the ideas I might offer to younger practitioners who are newer to the field, you know, that I know a lot of them get very nervous about doing harm, and they really care a lot about not wanting to make things for people. And one thing I would say is, um, if you stay genuinely curious, you're probably less at risk of doing any harm than interpreting, giving advice,
Right.
offering solutions. That kind
Even if you push a client to an uncomfortable place.
Say more. What do you mean?
Well, I think that there's a difference between safety and comfort. I think
Mm-hmm.
that for a
Mm-hmm.
lot of new therapists, those two ideas get really blurred.
Mm-hmm.
That I don't want to ask a hard question because I don't want to make a person uncomfortable, which really reflects on I don't want to make myself uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh my goodness, what am I going to do if this client across from me is super anxious? I think that what you're saying is that if you build a relationship around compassion, around curiosity, that gives you that gives you the space, that gives you permission to ask some of these tougher questions, but also to do so in a way that's warm, that's inviting of reflection, that's non-judgmental, non-shaming.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think those things can be said enough. It's so taken for granted that, practices of non-judgment, practices of, outside of blaming, are critically important to any effort to be helpful. And I guess what you said made me think about the idea of asking tough questions. I guess one of the things that helps me recognize is a skill that I've worked very, very hard on is staying really close to what the person's been saying, the words they're using, not introducing much new, but building on what's been said. And I think one of the things that helps with is not taking people kind of into spaces they're not prepared for.
Yeah.
And so I don't find people, often getting to places where they're uncomfortable about the territory we're talking about. They might not exactly know what the answer is yet for them, or kind of what their thinking is. And so there's certainly discomfort around that. But I appreciate you saying that, because it helps me be able to recognize that in my own history of practice.
Right. Right. I think that therapy is about addressing and to some capacity overcoming the discomforts of our life. The discomfort from problematic stories, the discomfort that comes from recognizing the amount of privilege in our stories, and being able to write alternative narratives for the ways that we tell our stories and the ways that we live.
Yeah, I mean, if we think about, one of the things I think about narrative is it's a social justice approach, because I think it's so much about power.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea, for example, of us talking about how normalizing judgments and discourses have a lot of power to sustain power relations that are unjust. So, like, if the story that everybody internalizes is that we should desire comfort, then anytime we are entering a territory of discomfort, we're vulnerable to turn somebody else into a problem. We're vulnerable to kind of get aggressive, confrontational, and in the service of maintaining our rights, our privileged rights to maintain comfort.
Yeah.
And so I see it as an ethical commitment to be comfortable with discomfort as a commitment to social justice, as a commitment to, doing power relations differently, doing white maleness differently, doing, whatever it might be. And, I'm so grateful to the narrative worldview, because for many people, I think it's not like they haven't thought these ideas before. They just haven't had the kind of language that's helped them articulate it for themselves. So for me, that's what that worldview has done, is it given me a language for things I think I knew, but I didn't know how to articulate. I didn't know how to put into practice.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. Harley and Anderson comes to mind in saying that language is really the only intervention that we have in therapy.
I would love a world where we become much more humble about ourselves as a species, and recognize that all we ever are is meaning makers.
Right.
And that we've been tricked in Western society for thousands of years that we are really truth finders, not meaning makers.
Yeah.
And so I think we could do relationships and accountability and power hopefully a whole lot differently if we were to kind of move into more of a recognition of ourselves as meaning makers.
Yeah. And it sounds like these two programs that you're presenting, 2019-2020, the apprenticeship program, the certificate program, are two ways that we can incorporate these principles both into our therapeutic practices and also into our lives and relationships.
Yeah, well said. That's exactly my hope and my dream. I started this because when I got to New England, I came here because when I was finishing my doctoral program at Syracuse in marriage and family therapy, I was looking for an internship where I could kind of become a part of a narrative community.
Mhm.
And at the time, there was a family therapy institute called the, Family Therapy Institute of Cambridge.
Okay, yep.
And there were a handful of people there who were, doing narrative stuff. They were hosting Michael White when he came to the US as one of the few spots he would teach in. Actually, this Family Institute of Cambridge, yeah. And it was Kathy Weingarten, who's now Kata Weingarten, and Sally Ann Roth, and Phil Decter, and Shizhuan Wu, and Betsy Buckley. And so there were a handful of people who were around here. And I started working at a big social service agency, the Home for Little Wanderers, doing home-based family therapy with Phil and Betsy and Shizhuan. And it was a lovely experience. But I was up on the North Shore and kind of out of that community a
Mm.
lot. So I started a place called the Salem Center up here in Salem. It
Oh,
was
cool.
a general postmodern therapy training program with two dear colleagues.
Yeah.
And I was doing a lot of narrative stuff, and they were doing kind of other kind of collaborative language systems, other traditions within this postmodern, post-structuralist world.
Mhm.
And then Michael died unexpectedly and tragically. And I think many of us who had the privilege to be his students, I was able to do a year-long training program at the Dulwich Center in Australia.
Oh, cool.
And so many of us felt a huge hole
Sure.
from his loss. And I think many of us have tried to figure out what to do as a response to try to keep these ideas growing. And they're growing fast around the rest of the world. It's hard to get them going here in the US.
Yeah.
But so that's when I decided to see if to break away from the Salem Center and begin the Narrative Therapy Initiative. And here we are, 10 years later, proud to be one of the team for NEAFAST. And
Yeah.
yeah,
You used a word earlier. Oh, you you used the word subversive a bit
yeah,
earlier,
yeah,
as a way of as a way of encouraging people to think, to not get so stuck inside the box of the agency world. And it sounds like the development of NTI is another version of that too. Another way of creating kind of a holistic, more humanistic model of doing therapy, and a state particularly that's very kind of centered around first order change, or around the medical model, the bureaucratic systems that reinforce that. Um, so thank you, first of all.
Oh, well, thank you for that. I mean, that's a gift to me. It's fun for me to have this description of NTI as a subversive organization, but it really fits.
Yeah.
I think you can be kind and respectful and hold stories and traditions and structures accountable in a way that makes change. I don't think,
Right.
I've experienced many legitimate ways of doing social justice work, and I think there's many pathways for that. And so I prefer the subversive one.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview. Again, www.narrativetherapyinitiative.org. And if people are interested in getting more information, how can they get in contact with you?
Yeah, my personal email address is srgaddis, Gaddis, @mac.com. And I welcome any and all interest in this. It's my passion, so it's never a burden for somebody to just call up and say, I don't know what I want to ask or talk about, but can we talk? We'll figure it out together.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope that you who are watching this get the chance to check out the website and learn more about narrative therapy.
Thank you, Jeremiah. This was lovely to have this time with you and, be asked questions, which I don't experience a lot. So that was very nice. And I look forward to our future growing relationship.
Definitely. Thanks.